I call the member for McKellar.
Thank you, Mr Acting Speaker. I rise to speak against this bill for good and sensible reasons which have caused the opposition to say that we will be voting against this bill. If you look at the analysis that the Digest has done of the amount of debt that is incurred by people who are locked up for breaking migration laws, and you look at the amount of money that is actually recovered, you'll find that by and large, the majority of the amounts of money that are incurred by way of detention expenses or detention charges are either written off or waived. So the argument is not, concerning this bill, is not one about whether or not people who are found subsequently to be refugees, legitimate refugees, are penalised. The argument is, what is the signal that is being sent to the people who are the people smugglers? Now, if you look at the history of the way in which the people smuggling business ramped up in the 90s and became almost of endemic proportions, you will find that the action that the Howard government took in saying very firmly that we will have strong border protection laws, that we will use offshore screening of people who claim to be refugees, so that we didn't see the rotting that went on of our court system, where people would destroy their documents of identification and claim to be different nationalities from the ones that they would be. There was no way of proving it one way or the other, and simply continuing to churn through our legal system and clog up those legal systems. We sent out a very strong message that Australia was very serious about saying, if you want to come to this country, then what you have to do is come in the proper legitimate ways. Where we have people who are found to be refugees, then they gained that status, and they came to Australia and lived here. In addition to that, we take the refugee quota, which makes us a very generous nation in terms of the number of refugees we take. When you make it on a per capita analysis, we are perhaps the most generous in the world. But it is important that we do protect our borders and also protect the people who are the cargo of, become the cargo of those people who are people smugglers and conduct that horrendous trade in people. In 2001, when we took that very strong stand and it became an election issue, up until that date, if you look at the 1990s, you will see that thousands of illegal people came by boat to this country. After we won the election in 2001, the number of boats and people that arrived in that method in 2002-03 was nil. Nil. It stopped. And for the next years, there were very small numbers. 2003-04, 3 boats came, 82 people. 2004-05, nil. Again, we won that election and said we were strong, that we would continue to protect our borders. Again, 2005-06, 8 boats came, 61 people. 2007-08, 3 boats came. But in August of 2008, the current government abolished temporary protection visas and sent a signal that said Australia was again to become a soft touch. Straight away, the boats started to come. The unscrupulous people who trade in human lives were again setting up their trade. They had taken the signal and said Australia's a soft touch. Temporary protection visas were gone. So since August of 2008, we've had 22 boats bringing 839 people, an enormous increase in that trafficking. By allowing this legislation to pass, or if the legislation is passed, it sends another signal. It sends a signal that we are again taking away from the strong stance we have had. In practical terms, it makes very little difference at all. Only 3.3% of all the debts that are incurred are actually recovered. The biggest proportion of them are written off. Now, written off doesn't mean to say they disappear. If circumstances came where it was shown that the people who had incurred those debts could indeed pay them, then they can be revived. The only way they are totally cannot be revived is if they are waived by the minister, the finance minister, pursuant to the Financial Management and Accountability Act. But the Digest, which has done a very good analysis of the bill, points out that departmental policy is that consideration should be given to writing off debts if the debtor resides overseas and cannot be traced, or is known to be destitute and there is no prospect of their financial situation improving in the future. It is waived by the minister on moral grounds rather than financial grounds, and where it is seen that there is an obligation that it should be waived, and where it has been found that the person was lawfully in Australia and should not have been detained, or where it is considered that repayment of a person's debt would cause them undue financial hardship. In those circumstances, it can and very often is waived. So the real central analysis of this bill is the signal it sends to the people smugglers to again bring their boats and putting the lives of people who are willing to pay them the large sums of money to enable them to have their lives placed at risk on those dangerous crossings. So the opposition, in choosing to oppose this bill, has chosen to do so in the national interest. It is not a decision that has been taken for any other reason. Australia believes that by having strong border protection laws, by having a strong message that is sent out and known by people who would be traders in human cargo, if they know that the likelihood of their being successful is not very great, then they are less likely to trade in that way. So it is very important that from an opposition's point of view, we continue to argue very strongly that it is in the national interest to have strong border protection laws, and it is in the interests of the people who would have their lives placed at risk by being the cargo of the people smugglers that we indeed are opposing the bill and will be voting against it. I know that there are some who think that by imposing, or rather leaving in place, the provisions that allow the fees to be collected, and they are in the vicinity, I think, of about $124 a day, that this is somehow a harsh or unusual thing to do. I don't believe it is. I think it is a fair and reasonable system, and one that was first put in place by the Labor government in 1992 and continued to be carried on by us. But the most important issue is that it would be sending a signal to the people smugglers if we don't oppose this bill and say when back in government this would be our policy. That's all. So I simply say, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, that in opposing and giving my support to the opposition's position that we are opposing the legislation, I do so because I believe it is in the national interest.